What happens when two of the most iconic generals in American history stand on the edge of a decision that could either end a nation's suffering or plunge it into unthinkable chaos? And what secret, buried in the final hours of the Civil War, pushed one commander toward surrender while driving the other toward an unrelenting victory? As the dawn broke over the quiet hills of Virginia, a moment approached that would rewrite the destiny of millions. But before that moment arrived, a series of desperate choices, hidden fears, and irreversible mistakes set the stage for one of history's most dramatic confrontations. Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee? At Appomattox, this is not simply the story of a surrender. It is the story of pride, exhaustion, strategy, and the final heartbeat of a Confederacy on its last breath. And as you follow every step of the journey, you'll uncover the emotional battles, the silent doubts, and the decisive actions that shaped the end of the American Civil War. Before we step into these final hours, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to witness is a story of tension, humanity, and the razor-thin line between collapse and triumph. The last march to Appomattox questions hang heavy in the humid April air of 1865. How long can a starving army survive when the world around it is collapsing? And what happens to a commander when every remaining choice leads toward inevitability? These questions echo across the quiet Virginia woods as General Robert E. Lee rides ahead of his men, his once proud army of Northern Virginia reduced to a fraction of its former strength. The soldiers who follow him do so not out of confidence in victory, but out of loyalty, desperation, and the faint hope that somewhere ahead lies food, safety, and a final chance at escape. Lee's uniform is dusty, his face lined with exhaustion. Behind his calm exterior lies a storm of doubt. The roads are clogged with wounded men, wagons splintered by weeks of retreat, and horses so thin their ribs show like the ridges of a washboard. Each step forward sounds like a march toward oblivion, yet Lee presses on, urging his army westward. His destination, Appomattox Station, where he hopes desperately to reach supply trains loaded with food and ammunition. It is a hope he clings to like a lifeline, even as reports of Union cavalry closing in grow more frequent and more grim. Far behind him, but advancing with relentless speed, is Ulysses S. Grant in these final days. Grant is not the slow, methodical general many remember. He is a storm driving the Union forces forward with precision and urgency, refusing to let Lee slip away yet again. Grant knows the Confederacy is breaking. He can feel it in the letters he receives from Washington, hear it in the tone of Lincoln's commanders, and sense it in the surrender rumors swirling across the North. But Grant wants something more than a victory. He wants an ending to the bloodshed, the heartbreak, the endless lists of dead and wounded. And he believes that ending can only come through Lee, yet history rarely bows to hopes. As Grant rides through thick mud and rain, he is struck with a sudden, searing pain. A migraine so severe that light itself feels like a blade cutting across his vision forces him to halt, dismount, and clutch his head in agony. His officers ride ahead without him, carrying his orders, his determination, his iron will. It is a strange twist of fate. The man driving the Union's final pursuit is, for the first time in weeks, physically brought to a standstill. But even that cannot slow the momentum of an army fueled by victory. Meanwhile, Lee's men drag themselves across fields that swallow their boots in mud. They pass quiet farms abandoned by families fearing the approach of two armies. Smoke hangs in the distance, rising from barns burned to deny shelter to enemy scouts. Children's toys lay scattered on porches left behind in haste. The fields, once green with spring promise, are scarred by cannon tracks and footprints, leading nowhere and everywhere at once, but the true devastation lies within the Confederate ranks. Hunger gnaws at the men. Some have not eaten in days. Many are barefoot, walking on bloodied feet wrapped in rags. Horses collapse mid-step, too weak to continue. Still, Lee rides among them, offering nods of encouragement, saying little but radiating a silent strength that his soldiers cling to. His presence alone is enough to keep them moving. Though the truth unspoken, but felt by all, is that this march may be their last. When the Confederate column reaches Appomattox Station, expectation turns to horror. The supply trains Lee hoped for have been seized by Union cavalry. Flames rise from burning cars, smoke drifting like a funeral shroud. Lee watches the fire flicker against the darkening sky, and in that moment he understands what this means. His army is out of options. Night falls heavy, dust mixing with the darkness like powder ready to ignite. Around campfires, soldiers whisper rumors, some wild, some painfully true. One says Sheridan's cavalry is closing in from the east. Another insists infantry columns are blocking the road to Lynchburg. A third whispers that Grant has offered surrender terms, though no one knows precisely what they are. Lee sits inside his tent, studying maps lit by a single flickering candle. His hand trembles for just a moment before he steadies it. His officers wait outside, exchanging anxious glances. They know their general well, and they know when he hesitates, even slightly. The situation is dire. In Washington, Lincoln awaits news he prays will end the war. Yet even as he hopes for peace, he fears humiliation for the defeated South will prolong bitterness for generations. Lincoln wants mercy. He wants reconciliation. He wants the Union restored not through vengeance, but through healing. He knows Grant understands this. And so he waits, knowing that on a muddy road in Virginia, history is shifting hour by hour. Back at Appomattox, Lee calls a council of his commanders. The men gather, weary and hollow-eyed, and discuss the impossible. Some urge an attempt to break through Union lines at dawn, a last gamble for survival. Others argue that surrender is inevitable and delay will only spill more blood for no gain. Lee listens, his expression unreadable, absorbing every word. When he finally speaks, his voice is calm, steady, yet tinged with sorrow. He agrees to attempt one final breakout at first light, led by General John B. Gordon. If they can clear the road, if they can reach Lynchburg, perhaps the Confederacy can fight a little longer. But deep down, Lee knows hope is bleeding out faster than his army. Morning comes quickly. A pale orange sunrise stretches across the fields, painting the sky with the colors of a quiet dawn untouched by the violence to come. But beneath that peaceful glow, the Confederate lines stir like a wounded animal preparing one last desperate leap. Gordon leads the charge, his men pushing forward with what little strength they have left. For a moment, glorious, brief, they succeed. They drive back Union pickets, force enemy cavalry to retreat, and open a path that seems, for a heartbeat, like salvation. Then the illusion shatters. As the Confederates advance, dense columns of Union infantry emerge from the trees, silent, resolute, unyielding. Blue-coated soldiers move into position like a wall closing around the Confederates, fresh troops pressing forward, rifles glinting in the morning light. Gordon's advance halts, then buckles. One by one, his officers ride back to Lee, faces grim, delivering the truth they can no longer deny. They are surrounded. Completely, Lee's shoulders sag for the first time in days. He nods slowly, absorbing the final blow. The moment he dreaded for months has arrived. He turns his horse and rides through the lines, past soldiers who watch him with a mixture of love, grief, and resignation. No words are spoken, but none are needed. They know what their general is about to do. As Lee rides toward the McLean house to meet Grant, his thoughts swirl with memories of the war's early days. Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Victories once celebrated like triumphs of destiny now feel distant, almost unreal. He wonders where it all changed, when the tide turned, when hope slipped through his fingers like sand. But there is little time for reflection now. The end awaits. Grant, still plagued by his splitting headache, pushes himself forward, determined to meet Lee with dignity and respect. He chooses not to wear a ceremonial uniform or polished boots. Instead, he dresses plainly, like a soldier who has shared the hardships of his men. It is a gesture Lee notices immediately upon arriving. And though the two men could not be more different, one raised in aristocratic tradition, the other molded by perseverance and grit, they share a mutual respect forged by war. Before they speak, there is silence. A silence heavy with the weight of history, of lives lost, of a nation fractured. Then Grant gently begins the conversation, offering terms that reflect mercy rather than triumph. Lee listens, nodding occasionally, his expression betraying relief and sorrow intertwined. Both men know this moment is bigger than victory or defeat. It is the first step toward healing a nation torn apart, and as Grant writes the terms of surrender, as Lee signs his name with steady dignity, the world shifts. But this is only the beginning of the story. The emotions, the betrayals, the human struggles behind these final hours run deeper than the surrender itself. When you are ready to continue the journey into the heart of these final moments, the next chapter awaits. The terms that could break a nation. What do you say to the man you've spent years trying to destroy when he finally rides to meet you in defeat? And how do you end a war without planting the seeds for the next one? Outside the small brick house of Wilmer McLean, the world feels like it's holding its breath. Union and Confederate soldiers stand scattered along the dirt road, some leaning against fence posts, others gripping their rifles with white-knuckled hands. No one knows exactly what is happening inside the house, but every man understands that whatever passes between the two generals under that roof will change his life forever. Inside, the room is strangely ordinary for such a moment. A simple table, a few chairs, a patterned carpet underfoot. No trumpets. No banners. No grand stage. Just two men, dusty and exhausted, confronting the weight of history. Grant enters first, shoulders slightly hunched, his plain private's coat still spattered with mud. He does not look like the victorious conqueror of a shattered rebellion. He looks like a man who has slept too little, ridden too far, and carried too much. When Lee steps in, every eye in the room seems to follow him. In contrast to Grant, Lee appears almost ceremonial, dressed in a clean gray uniform with polished boots and a sword at his side. The difference is striking. The defeated commander looks more like the old image of honor. The victorious one, more like the embodiment of endurance. For a long moment, neither man speaks about the war. Instead, they talk quietly about old days, about Mexico, where their paths had once crossed in another conflict. It is small talk, almost painfully ordinary, but beneath it lies something deeper, two men trying to bridge the gap between enemy and human. The officers watching feel the tension like a tightening rope. They wonder when the conversation will finally turn to the thing they all came for. Eventually, Grant breaks the silence. He shifts uncomfortably, pulls out a small piece of paper, and begins to write. The room stills. Every scratch of his pen on the paper sounds magnified, as if even the house is listening. Grant writes slowly, carefully choosing each word, as though he knows that these sentences will echo far beyond Appomattox. His terms are not what many expected. No trials for treason. No executions. No humiliating parade of defeated soldiers forced to kneel. Grant offers something different, something unexpected: honor. The Confederate officers will keep their sidearms, a symbol of their dignity. The soldiers will be allowed to go home, not to some distant prison camp, but back to their families, their farms, their ruined towns, and most astonishing of all, they will be allowed to keep their horses and mules. The twist lands like thunder in a clear sky. Those animals, Grant knows, are not just property. They are survival. In the coming months, the men who once fired rifles at Union soldiers will need those horses to plant crops, rebuild fields, and feed their families. Without them, surrender would mean not only defeat, but starvation. With them, perhaps, lies a chance at rebuilding. Grant's officers are surprised, some even unsettled. After so much death, so much sacrifice, is this truly enough? Mercy instead of punishment? There is a quiet turning point in Grant's mind. One he doesn't say aloud but feels with absolute certainty. If he crushes the South beneath his heel now, he will win the war but lose any hope for peace. He chooses a different kind of victory. He finishes writing and slides the document across the table toward Lee. Lee reads in silence. His face is carved from stone, but his eyes move steadily across the lines. The room feels suffocating. A few officers exchange brief glances, wondering, will he accept? Will he demand changes? Will he reject these terms and drag his men into a new kind of war, the desperate, bitter guerrilla conflict many fear? Lee pauses over the lines about the horses. His fingers linger there. He thinks of the men who have followed him to the end of the world and back, the ones standing barefoot in the mud outside, who have endured hunger, cold, and loss beyond imagination. He imagines them returning home without even the means to plow a field. He can almost hear the echo of their wives' voices, their children's empty stomachs. He feels the weight of pride on one side, and the weight of responsibility on the other. When he finally looks up, his voice is soft but steady. The terms, he says, are generous. In that moment, you can almost feel the war beginning to loosen its grip. He signs. The climax of 4 years of bloodshed arrives in a few simple strokes of ink. No cannons fire. No flags fall. No dramatic speeches ring out over the hills. Just the scratch of pens and the sound of breathing in a cramped Virginia parlor. And yet something darker still lurks just outside this moment. Because while this surrender marks the end of Lee's army, it does not instantly erase the hatred, the grief, the anger seared into millions of hearts. There are Confederate officers who would rather melt into the wilderness and fight on as raiders and partisans. There are politicians in Richmond and beyond who would rather see the South burn than bend. There are Union men who crave revenge, who want to see their enemies punished, not pardoned. For now, though, word begins to spread. Outside the McLean house, a rumor moves through the lines like a ripple in still water. Lee has surrendered. At first, many refused to believe it. Surrender? After all the march, all the battles, all the whispered promises of one more campaign, one more chance, one more miracle? Some men stare blankly at the horizon as if they can't process what the words even mean. Others sag where they stand, knees shaking, the strength finally draining from their bodies. On the Union side, the reaction is just as intense but different. Some soldiers cheer, throw their caps into the air, embrace each other with fierce joy. Others simply sit down and weep, thinking of the friends who died on the march to reach this day. The sound of celebration begins to rise, but when Grant hears it, he does something unexpected. He orders it stopped. No cheering, he insists. Not here, not now. The defeated army outside is not a trophy to be paraded. It is a broken force of human beings who have lost everything. Grant will not allow their humiliation to be part of the Union's victory. He knows that if there is ever to be a United States again, it cannot be built on the ashes of deliberate shame. This is another twist no one expected from the unconditional surrender general. He is not interested in crushing Lee, only in ending the killing. The hours after the signing unfold oddly, like a world caught between two realities. Officially, the war in Virginia is over, but the structures of war are still all around. Men who were trying to kill each other days, even hours ago, now stand within earshot, guarding their positions out of habit more than purpose. The flags still fly. The guns still rest in their emplacements. But a thin, invisible line has been crossed. Later, when Lee rides away from the McLean house, the silence around him feels heavier than gunfire. His men watch him pass, searching his face for a sign, a cue about how they should feel. He has always been the rock they anchored themselves to, the symbol of their cause. Now, seeing his grave, exhausted expression, they understand at last. It is over. Some weep openly. Others stare at the ground, fists clenched. A few mutter angrily under their breath, already fantasizing about what might have been if only they had broken through that morning. If only the trains hadn't been captured, if only reinforcements had arrived. 1,000 if-onlys swirling in the air like smoke. That evening, Grant sits alone for a rare moment, rubbing his temples as his headache throbs on. He has won the victory every Union general before him had chased and failed to grasp. Yet the weight on his shoulders is not lighter. He has just helped close the bloodiest chapter in American history. But what comes next feels like a new battlefield entirely, one fought not with cannons and rifles, but with policies, promises, and fragile human hearts. Far away in Washington, the news will soon reach Abraham Lincoln, who will feel his own mixture of relief, gratitude, and cautious hope. He has dreamed of binding up the nation's wounds, and now, finally, there is a path forward. Or so it seems. Because even as Appomattox offers the hope of peace, unseen forces are already moving in the shadows. getting ready to strike at the very man who wants a gentle peace. Plans whispered in back rooms. Faces twisted with rage over the thought of reunification on generous terms. Hearts that cannot accept defeat, even when their generals have. The war between Grant and Lee may be ending, but a new, more treacherous moment in America's story is just beginning to form. And as darkness settles over Appomattox on that first night of peace, one haunting question rises above all the rest. Now that the guns have fallen silent, who will accept this new future? And who will do anything to destroy it? The night the war refused to die, what if peace can be written on paper, yet war still lingers in the hearts of men? And what happens when the silence after surrender becomes more terrifying than the thunder of battle? The sun dipped beneath the ridges of Appomattox, leaving the sky bruised with streaks of purple and gold. For the first time in 4 long years, an evening settled over Virginia without the sound of artillery or the crack of rifle fire. But the quiet was not comforting. It felt unnatural, like the sudden stillness before a storm no one can see but everyone can feel. Inside the Confederate camps, soldiers moved as if in a dream. Some sat staring at the embers of dying fires, watching the sparks drift upward like lost hopes. Others clung to their rifles even though they would soon be stacked, surrendered, their barrels never to roar again. For these men, life had been carved into 2 simple truths: follow Lee and fight for the Confederacy. Now the cause was gone, and all that remained were questions no one dared to ask. General James Longstreet walked through the camp with quiet steps, studying the faces of his men. He had stood beside Lee through victory and disaster, but nothing had prepared him for this. He knew that surrender was the right choice, perhaps the only choice, but watching the heartbreak on the faces of soldiers who had given everything, for a lost nation cut deeper than any wound he had taken in battle. He found Lee in his tent, sitting at a small field desk, staring at a letter he had begun but could not seem to finish. His usually flawless penmanship stuttered across the page as if his thoughts were unraveling. Longstreet hesitated in the doorway. He had seen Lee wary, angry, even grieving, but never defeated in spirit. Tonight, though, the great general looked like a man carrying the weight of an entire region on his shoulders. Lee didn't look up. Instead, his voice drifted into the dim lamplight, low and hollow. "I wonder," he murmured, "whether history will understand this day or condemn it." Longstreet stepped forward. "History will remember that you ended the killing when there was no hope left." A faint, sad smile touched Lee's lips. "Some will not forgive me for that." He was right. Even now, beyond the campfires, small knots of Confederate officers whispered angrily under their breath. A few cursed Lee's decision. Others spoke of leaving Virginia and fighting on as guerrillas in the mountains. They dreamed of an invisible war, one without front lines, where bitterness could run wild and vengeance could be hunted, like prey. But Lee knew the truth. A resistance like that would not prolong the Confederacy. It would destroy what little remained of the South. It would unleash suffering far beyond the battlefield, bringing fire and ruin to the very people the soldiers claimed to protect. Still, the danger of rebellion inside his own shattered ranks was real. And tonight, that danger would begin to take shape. While Lee wrestled with the sorrow of what he had done, Ulysses S. Grant sat in the upstairs room of a small farmhouse offered to him by a local family. The house was plain, cluttered with mismatched chairs and simple quilts, and smelled faintly of wood smoke. Grant appreciated it more than he could express. He was capable of sleeping anywhere on a saddle, under a tree, even on the frozen ground, but tonight he wanted a moment of quiet. He removed his boots slowly, wincing as the ache in his head flared like lightning. His migraine had worsened during the day, hammering behind his eyes with every heartbeat, but he hid it from his officers. Victory, after all, was not a place for weakness. On the bedside table lay the letter he would send to Washington announcing Lee's surrender. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, Grant felt only the solemn responsibility of what came next. The war, in military terms, was ending. But the healing, if America was even capable of healing, was just beginning. He stretched out on the bed, hoping desperately that sleep would dull the pain in his skull. But rest would not come. His mind churned with the faces of the men he had lost, the battles that had ground his army down. The blood-soaked ground stretched across states. He had marched through again and again. Then another face appeared, Lincoln. The president's weary expression lingered in Grant's thoughts. The man who wanted forgiveness more than revenge. The man who believed the country could rebuild only if mercy outweighed punishment. The man who had told Grant, quietly but firmly, "Let them up easy." Grant was determined to honor that. But he also knew something Lincoln did not. There were men in the North and the South who would never accept reconciliation. Men who believed vengeance was justice. Men who believed submission was slavery. Men who believed the war could be resurrected if they struck at the right moment, in the right way. And as Grant lay awake, fighting sleep, he wondered whether killing could truly stop just because two generals agreed it should, down by the riverbank. Where shadows stretched long under the moonlight, a group of Confederate cavalry officers met in absolute secrecy. Their voices were hushed but sharp, like the hiss of steel being drawn from a sheath. "This surrender is a betrayal," one murmured. "Lee gave up too soon. He had no right," another snarled. The men would have fought on. A third leaned in, eyes glinting with dangerous resolve. "If the government falls, if the Yankees lose their head, we can rise again." The others glanced around nervously, but no one disagreed. "If someone removes Lincoln," the first whispered, "the Union will fracture. The North will divide, and we will have our chance." For a moment, even the night seemed to freeze. None of them knew that in Washington, a man named John Wilkes Booth was already nurturing the same poisonous thought, feeding it with rage, resentment, and a twisted belief that he could save the South by spilling a single drop of blood. The war had been decided, but the hatred it had created was still searching for a target. In the morning, as the mist rolled through Appomattox, Grant and Lee would meet again, not to argue, not to write new terms, but to oversee the symbolic gesture the world would remember for generations: the stacking of Confederate rifles, the furling of battle flags, the final act of surrender. But that moment had not yet arrived. Tonight, an uneasy calm ruled the camps. Union soldiers slept with tears still drying on their cheeks. Confederate soldiers lay awake, wondering what awaited them at home. Grant fought the pain behind his eyes, knowing his work had only just begun. Lee stared at the unfinished letter on his desk, unsure how to explain to his people why ending the fight was the only choice left. And across the dark countryside, unseen and unheard, the first threads of a new tragedy were beginning to weave themselves into America's future. The war between Grant and Lee was ending, but another war, the war for the soul of the nation, was quietly rising in the shadows. The day the flags fell, what does a soldier feel when the rifle he carried across 1,000 miles is taken from his hands for the last time? And what happens to an army when the symbols it bled for are lowered into silence? Morning crept over Appomattox with a soft golden haze, but nothing about the dawn felt gentle. The air carried a strange tension, as if it belonged to two worlds at once, one where war was ending, and one where grief was only just beginning. The fields glistened with dew, and the roads were already stirring with the hushed movements of men preparing for a ritual no one had ever witnessed on American soil: the formal laying down of an entire army. In the center of the Confederate camp, soldiers slowly gathered. Some stood stiffly, hands trembling. Others looked numb, their faces drained of color. They had marched under these flags since the war's first days, their stripes and stars stained with smoke, dirt, and the blood of friends they had buried along the way. Now those banners hung limp, waiting for the moment they would be folded forever. General John B. Gordon rode forward. His uniform faded but immaculate, his posture rigid despite the exhaustion pulling at his features. His horse's hooves thudded softly against the earth, each step echoing the weight of 4 years of war. Gordon was tasked with leading the 1st Confederate Division to surrender. He was determined to do it with dignity, even if his heart ached with every breath. On the opposite side of the clearing, Union General Joshua Chamberlain watched quietly. Chamberlain, the scholar-turned-warrior who had once held the line at Little Round Top, stood with a solemn expression, aware that the moment about to unfold would be written into history. He had read Grant's orders: treat the Confederates not as defeated foes, but as fellow Americans returning home. But Chamberlain didn't need those instructions. He understood instinctively that humiliation now would darken the peace later. As the Confederate column approached, Gordon hesitated. His eyes traveled over the blue uniforms rising like a wall across the field. For a second, something in him wavered, some last flicker of pride bracing itself for shame. Then something unexpected happened. Chamberlain raised his sword not in triumph, but in salute, a gesture of respect, a gesture of honor. A gesture no one on either side had prepared for a heartbeat. Gordon froze. His breath hitched. Then, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, he rose slightly in his saddle and returned the salute with a trembling hand. It was a turning point, a small one, perhaps, but profound enough to ripple through the ranks. Confederate soldiers straightened their backs. Union soldiers softened their expressions. For a moment the blue and the gray stood not as enemies, but as men who had suffered too much to continue hating. But not everyone felt relief. At the edge of the crowd, a pair of Confederate cavalry officers watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. These were the same men who had whispered in the darkness hours earlier, dreaming of rebellion. One of them muttered under his breath, "Saluting us like we're equals. They want us docile. That's all." The other shook his head. "Lee may accept this peace. I do not." They turned away from the ceremony, slipping into the trees, but inside the clearing, the ritual continued. Gordon signaled his troops forward. Column after column of Confederate soldiers marched past the stacked rifles and began to lay their own weapons down in orderly rows. The clatter of metal hitting wood created a strange, haunting rhythm. Some men placed their rifles gently, almost tenderly, as if handling the last relics of a vanished world. Others tossed them down with a sense of finality, unable to bear the sight of them any longer. Next came the flags, one by one. Color-bearers stepped forward carrying the tattered banners that had once rallied their men through the worst hellfire of battle. Each flag was folded slowly, reverently. Some men reached out to touch the cloth as it passed them, whispering farewells. A few turned away, unable to watch. Tears glistened on hardened cheeks, streaking through dirt and dried sweat. Chamberlain observed all of it with a heavy heart. He understood victory. He understood duty. But he also understood grief. As the Confederate soldiers walked past him barefoot, hungry, gone, he felt no triumph in their suffering, only sorrow for what the war had carved out of all of them. Across the field, Lee watched from horseback, flanked by a small group of officers. He sat tall, grave, his expression carved from granite. He had never been one to wear his emotions openly, but the lines around his mouth were deeper today. His army was not being defeated, it was being dismantled. Piece by piece, flag by flag, rifle by rifle. Behind him, Longstreet spoke quietly. "The men will remember this day for the rest of their lives?" Lee nodded slowly. "So will I." But something unsettled him. He could not shake the feeling that peace, fragile as eggshell, could shatter at any moment. Too many men on both sides carried too much bitterness. Too much death lay unburied across the land. And in the shadows of the woods behind the camp, he sensed movement, whispers of unrest he could not yet name. Grant arrived just as the last flag was folded. He watched in silence, his face pale from the lingering headache, but his gaze steady. He had expected relief. Instead, what he felt was responsibility vast and crushing. The ceremony did not end the war for good. It only ended one part of it. Once the final rifles were stacked, a strange quiet settled over the field. Soldiers who had expected to feel closure felt something else instead, uncertainty. What now? What waited for them beyond these hills? Homes burned? Families gone? A future rebuilt on ashes? Lee approached Grant, stopping just a few feet away. For a moment neither spoke. Then Lee said softly, "It is done." Grant nodded. "Yes, but there is still much ahead?" Lee studied him, searching his face. "You mean to hold the country together?" Grant paused. "Yes," Lee exhaled slowly, as if releasing a truth he had known but fought to accept. "Then God help you." because men will not. As they turned away, a distant thunder rolled across the horizon, not from cannons, but from a gathering storm. Dark clouds crawled over the sky, casting long shadows across the field of surrendered rifles. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of tents. Howling through the treetops like a warning, Grant looked up, brow furrowing. Lee did the same. Neither man said it. But both felt it. The war had ended on paper, but in the hearts of thousands, it still smoldered like embers waiting for the right gust of wind. And far from Appomattox, in a city glowing with gas lamps and restless energy, a man dressed in black paced the floor of a boarding-house bedroom, ranting to the walls and planning a strike he believed would save the South. The storm was coming, and it would change everything. The last ride before the darkness. What if the war wasn't truly over, only waiting for one final spark? And what if the man destined to strike that spark had already set his plan in motion while the generals of the nation looked away? Night settled over Appomattox with a restless wind that rattled loose shutters and stirred the embers of dying campfires. The surrendered flags lay folded in silence. The stacked rifles stood motionless like gravestones marking the end of a nation, yet something in the air felt unfinished. The soldiers sensed it. The officers sensed it. Even the horses, shifting nervously in their lines, seemed aware of a looming unease that did not belong to a land stepping into peace. Inside his tent, Lee sat in full uniform, though exhaustion pulled at every muscle. His sword lay across his lap, untouched. He stared at it not as a symbol of pride, but as a reminder of decisions he had never wanted to make. He had led an army through victory and disaster. He had chosen surrender to save what remained of the South. But tonight, as the lamplight flickered across the canvas walls, he wondered whether surrender would truly spare his people, or whether it had merely opened the door to a new kind of suffering. A soft rustle at the entrance broke his thoughts. Longstreet stepped in quietly, his expression serious. "There are rumors spreading," Longstreet said, lowering his voice. "Some men believe the Confederacy still lives. They think resistance might rise again. They're speaking of hidden groups, scattered officers, and vengeance." Lee's shoulders stiffened. He had feared this. He closed his eyes for a moment, then looked up with a mixture of weariness and resolve. "The Confederacy is dead," he said firmly. "Anyone who fights on now fights without a nation behind him. They fight only to destroy what little remains." Longstreet nodded, but his eyes reflected the unease lingering beneath the surface of the camps. There were too many men who had lost too much. Too many who believed surrender was dishonor. Too many who would not follow Lee into peace the way they had followed him into war. Lee knew what must be done. At dawn, he would ride to speak to the men one last time, one last plea, one last order. He hoped they would listen, but dawn was hours away, and the night had plans of its own. Across the valley, Grant was awake as well, pacing slowly outside the farmhouse where he'd chosen to spend the night. The storm clouds from the afternoon had settled into a low, oppressive cover that allowed no stars through. He walked with one hand pressed lightly against his forehead, trying to ease the pounding in his skull. His migraine had grown worse, and though he hid it from his officers, he could not hide it from himself. The fog thickened around him as he walked, softening the outlines of tents and trees. Every now and then, the faint murmur of voices drifted from the Union camp. Men talked about the future, about going home, about wives and children, about work waiting for them in farms and factories. But beneath their hope, Grant sensed something else: fear, uncertainty, the quiet dread of a nation stitched back together with threads too thin to hold. He paused, looking out over the darkness. A thought pressed at him, unwelcome but relentless. What if peace was more dangerous than war? During the war, he had known his enemy, known his objective, known his mission. Peace offered no such clarity. Peace meant rebuilding a nation overflowing with grief and anger. Peace meant facing the political storms already gathering in Washington. Peace meant confronting the men Northern and Southern, who believed mercy was weakness. The memory of Lincoln's voice whispered through his mind, "Let them up easy." Grant wanted to honor that. But he also feared that kindness would provoke those who wanted. Revenge instead of restoration, he turned back toward the farmhouse, unaware that on the distant roads leading away from Appomattox, two Confederate officers were already riding hard through the woodsmen who had refused the surrender, who believed they could save their cause through darker means. Their destination was Richmond. Their intention was to join forces with others who spoke openly of resisting reunion at any cost, and one name kept surfacing in their whispers: Booth. The next morning arrived heavy with fog. The mist clung to the ground, wrapping the soldiers in a pale, ghost-like haze. As the first light filtered through, Lee mounted Traveler, his faithful gray war-horse, and rode slowly into the center of the camp. The men rose as he approached, their expressions somber, some hopeful, some bitter. He stopped before them, scanning faces he had known for years, faces hardened by battle, faces shadowed by loss. Then he spoke. "This war is now at an end," he said, his voice steady but low. "The men who have fought with me have been brave and true. I thank you for your loyalty and your sacrifices. But now the responsibility we carry is not to fight, but to rebuild." The men shifted, listening intently. "Go home," Lee said. "Return to your families. Devote yourselves to peace. Do not engage in lawless acts. Do not follow those who promise glory and resistance. That path leads only to ruin." Silence followed his words, deep, heavy, fragile. Some soldiers nodded, tears brimming. Others stared at the ground, refusing to accept the truth. A few turned away, stiff with resentment. Lee saw it in their eyes, even if they hid it. Not everyone would follow him into peace. Later that day, Grant arrived for a brief meeting. Though it was meant to be procedural, something unexpected flickered between the two men, and unspoken, understanding that both now carried the future of a broken nation on their shoulders. "You did what you had to do," Grant told him quietly. Lee looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now the cost will reveal itself." As the two generals parted ways, the fog began to lift from the fields, but not from the hearts of the men waiting for orders, nor from the country bracing for a future no one fully understood. That afternoon, a courier rode into camp with a message for Grant. It was marked urgent, bearing the seal of the War Department. Grant opened it quickly, and as his eyes scanned the lines, something in his expression hardened. Longstreet saw the change and approached. "Bad news?" Grant folded the letter carefully, his face suddenly pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Something is moving in Richmond," he said quietly. "Someone is preparing to strike." "Strike at what?" Longstreet asked. Grant's voice dropped to a whisper. "Not what." "Who?" A gust of wind swept through the camp, rattling the stacked rifles like bones. Grant didn't finish the sentence, but the truth hung in the air like a blade, because the one man whose death could shatter the fragile peace of the nation, the one man whose loss would ignite the fire the extremists dreamed of, was the same man standing at the very center of America's hope. Abraham Lincoln. The storm was moving fast, and not even Appomattox could stop it. The last piece before the tragedy. What if the moment the nation needed hope the most was the moment it was destined to lose it? And what if the final victory at Appomattox was only the quiet inhale before history exhaled its darkest breath? The news of Lee's surrender traveled faster than any courier could ride, carried by rumor, carried by soldiers, carried by the wind itself. By the time it reached Washington, the streets erupted with cheers that shook the Capitol to its bones. Bands played in the squares. Cannons fired in celebration. People danced beneath gas lamps until the streets were glowing with the energy of a nation on the brink of rebirth, and at the center of it all stood Abraham Lincoln, watching the celebrations through the tall windows of the White House with a strange mixture of joy and weariness. His shoulders sagged not from disappointment, but from a relief so deep it nearly brought him to tears. He had feared this day would never come, feared the Union would collapse before peace could be secured. But now, as the noise of the crowds drifted upward into the warm April night, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope still, beneath the joy. Something uneasy tugged at him like an echo from far away, a warning he could not name. He dismissed the feeling, telling himself it was exhaustion. But even as he smiled at the crowds below, a shadow lingered behind him in the lamplight. Long and thin and stretching across the room like a silent omen, that same night, as Washington celebrated, Appomattox grew unnervingly quiet. The Union camp settled into a drowsy calm, while the Confederate camps hovered somewhere between stunned and hollow. The surrender had happened. The rifles had been laid down. And yet, neither army knew exactly what to do with its newfound stillness. Grant walked through the Union camp after nightfall, each step slow and deliberate. His headache had eased slightly, but the weight on his chest had grown heavier. The letter delivered earlier still sat in his coat pocket, its warnings gnawing at him like a restless thought. Something is moving in Richmond. Something aimed at the president. He couldn't shake it. The fog swirling through his memory of recent events made it worse. The whispers in the Confederate ranks. The officers who rode into the woods. The strange tension that clung to the air even after the flags had been folded. He had watched the war end, but he did not trust peace. Not yet. A guard saluted as Grant passed, but Grant scarcely noticed. His thoughts kept circling back to Lincoln. The president had carried the nation on his shoulders for 4 years, absorbing every criticism, every heartbreak, every moment of darkness. Now he finally had a chance to lead America into a gentler era, and yet the danger was unmistakable. Grant paused at the edge of a quiet ridge overlooking the Confederate camp. Lanterns glowed softly among the tents. Men moved like ghosts, their shapes barely visible through the rising mist. Somewhere, a harmonica played a slow, drifting tune that carried across the valley like a lullaby from another world. He closed his eyes. "Keep him safe," Grant whispered to the night, though he had no one to whisper to. "God, keep him safe." The next morning brought a crisp, bright sky over Virginia. Birds darted between the trees as if unaware the world had changed. Lee prepared to leave Appomattox, to ride home to an uncertain future. His army would disperse within hours, each man carrying a personal parole signed by Grant himself, a promise that no Union soldier would harm or arrest them, as long as they laid down their arms. It was an extraordinary gesture, and Lee recognized it as such. He knew Grant was trying to prevent small pockets of resistance from turning into full-blown chaos. He knew Grant was trying to protect the South from itself. As Lee mounted Traveler, a hush fell over the Confederate camp. Men gathered around him, waiting for one last word. Lee did not give a speech. He simply removed his hat, holding it over his heart, and nodded to the men who had followed him through the worst crucible of their lives. Then he turned and rode away, the sound of Traveler's hooves echoing like a slow farewell. On the other side of the valley, Grant watched him ride. There was no hatred in his gaze, no triumph, only respect and a deep, unspoken sorrow, because Grant knew that while Lee's war was ending, another battle for the nation's soul was already rising. One he could not fight with armies, one he could not win with strategy, one that would come down to whether America's longing for peace was stronger than the hatred brewing in its shadows. Later that afternoon, a courier galloped into camp with a breathless urgency. Grant recognized him as soon as he saw the rider's pale face and trembling hands. "Message from Washington, General." Grant took the envelope, hand steady though his pulse quickened. He broke the seal with his thumb and unfolded the letter. His eyes skimmed the words. Once, then again, and for the first time since the war began, a chill ran down his spine. Booth has been seen in Richmond. He has gathered sympathizers. He speaks openly of striking down the president. The danger is immediate. Grant folded the letter with trembling fingers. He looked toward the horizon, toward the distant northeast where Washington lay bathed in celebration and unsuspecting joy. And for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. He handed the letter to an aide, voice tense. "Prepare transportation. We may need to leave for Washington sooner than expected." "Yes, sir." But as the aide hurried away, Grant's thoughts spun, searching for the path ahead. The war had trained him to read danger before it surfaced, and everything in him screamed that danger was closer than anyone realized. The men who had ridden out of Appomattox, the ones Lee could not reach, the ones twisted by bitterness, had not disappeared. They had purpose. They had fury. They had found a leader, and the president, the man who wanted healing more than victory, was stepping into the most perilous moment of his life without knowing it. As the sun dipped into the west, painting the sky with streaks of blood-red light, Grant stood motionless, staring into the distance. The war had ended, but the darkness was only beginning to break open, and somewhere far away, in a crowded theater in Washington, a man named John Wilkes Booth was making final preparations for a night he believed would save the Confederacy, and in doing so, doom the peace Grant and Lee had fought to secure.